Welcome to Holy Health, the podcast where cutting-edge health insights meet timeless biblical wisdom. Join us as we explore the latest in wellness, fitness, and mental health, all while grounding our journey in the spiritual truths and guidance found in the Torah. Whether you're looking to nourish your body, mind, or soul, we'll help you live a life of balance, vitality, and faith. Tune in to discover how to achieve holistic health through the perfect blend of modern science and ancient wisdom. Let's dive into the fullness of life, body, and spirit together. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the pre-Purim episode of the Holy Health Podcast. Last week, we talked about female menopause, a conversation we've had on more than one occasion. And just like when you were younger and you were pregnant, and all of a sudden, everywhere you were looking, everybody seemed to be pregnant, the same seems to be with menopause. I hear menopause discussed on so many of the podcasts that I listen to. I see so much discussion about menopause on my Facebook page with the variety of different practitioners and people, and all of a sudden everybody's a menopause expert. Well, this week, this is not a Purim joke, I figured it would be only fair to bring our menopause episode back out. Yes, it is true. Just like women, well, not really just like women, men's or male menopause is not exactly the same as female menopause, but I learned a lot from this episode. I had interviewed Bryce Wylde, who is a co-founder of the DNA company, quite some time ago. I want to say probably even before the beginning of the war. And this episode was put out sometime after October 7th, and it was not as widely listened to as it should have been. So I figured after last week's throwback to menopause, bringing out our episode with Dr. Mary Ben-Ami, it's only fair that we bring this menopause episode back out. And ladies, share this with your husbands. Listen to it first, because you can learn a lot from this. And there's information here that your husbands, your partners, or your male friends should have. So I want to wish everybody a happy Purim, a Chag Sameach, and just like that evil decree on Purim was turned around and turned upside down, I hope this evil decree of what's going on here in Israel and around the world to the Jewish people is turned around this Purim as well. And please give me feedback. I'd love to know what you guys think of this episode. I have several more episodes that have been sitting in the episode vault for a while that will be coming out over the next few weeks. I'm looking for some Torah experts to help me with these things. And if any of you are doing something that you feel might interest our listeners, please be in touch with me, because I'm going to start interviewing again soon as well. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Holy Health. My guest today is Bryce Wylde. Bryce is a Canadian alternative health practitioner and television personality. He's the host of the television show Wylde on Health and has also written several books on alternative health and wellness. Wylde is a proponent of integrative medicine, which seeks to combine the best of conventional and alternative approaches to healthcare. He's also one of the co-founders of the DNA company, which, as you guys know, was one of my favorite episodes so far. And he's done so much more than I just read in that bio. I just picked his short bio to read, but I want to welcome you here. Thank you so much for coming on.
I appreciate you having me. Appreciate this very much. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you. So there's so many different topics that we could talk about, but I had decided a while ago that I was really interested in doing an episode on male menopause. So I did what anybody would do. I went to Spotify. I stuck it in the search bar, figuring I'd find someone that had been on someone's podcast talking about male menopause, and I'd listen and see what I thought. And your podcast was, I don't remember whose podcast it was that you were on, but it was someone's podcast. And I was like, he seems great. And then I started to look into you a little, and I saw that you were part of the DNA company and reached out to you. And I'm really excited that you are here today.
Well, I'm excited to be here as well. It's been one of the sub focuses in my clinical practice. I've taken a special interest in it in the 22 years that I've been in a functional medicine practice. And I just feel like it's not really universally recognized, this concept of andropause, which we affectionately refer to as manopause. So unlike female menopause, of course, andropause is not really accepted by medical professionals as a distinct medical condition. And that's really where a lot of folks fall on my doorstep, is couldn't get any help anywhere else. So let's go to the alternative, which, by the way, don't love the term. I think that we've been revered as alternative medicine for too long. Hence, we've adopted this functional medicine terminology, which is really a blend of East and West, and ultimately what works best when the body's out of whack. In this case, this doesn't really distill down to a single thing like testosterone, so we'll unpack that. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about the body in dysfunction or not functioning optimally, such as the deficiency in vitamin D, we can correct it often by getting exposed to the sun or giving an individual, additional amounts of vitamin D, in the body then works better on its own. No miracle to that. So the same way where there's, potentially beyond normal homeostasis, dysregulation of hormones into a male's later life, we may be able to manage that better and employ, hormones, in some cases herbs, so that this individual works better. There's just no miracle to this, right? It's just optimizing the human condition so that we lead healthier, longer lives. And again, on that level, if we're being picky about vernacular, it's health span, not just lifespan. So living longer lives with optimal health. If and when, sort of full circle, one experiences true clinical andropause, as a male, loss of certain hormones, particularly testosterone, their health span is going to decline, and very likely also their lifespan.
Wow. So could you talk a little bit about maybe symptoms that people might be feeling? Now, I would say that the majority of the listeners here are women, but many of them are married to men. So I feel like it's something that, like you're saying, is just not so well known. So what are some of the symptoms that maybe people might be having if they're experiencing this?
So this is pan-symptomatic. That means all systems are involved here. This is not just the typical male pattern baldness or hair loss that we might associate with testosterone being too high or low, or increased fat mass. We're talking about, decline in cognitive function, depression, visibly what we know as man boobs or gynecomastia. I think one of the most important things we should probably cover is sarcopenia, or the speed at which there is significant muscle loss and percentage to age in decline. But just like in menopause with females, there's also reduction in bone loss. There's an osteoporotic risk in men as well, a fracture risk. Again, visibly, clinically, testicular atrophy. It can happen for some men. That translates also into, of course, decreased sexual desire, libido, and then a significant speed of decline and descent in skin elasticity. I think a lot fewer men. I just don't. I may be stereotyping here, gender typing, whatever you want to call it, but I feel like men are less inclined to be picky about their visible, facial decline and wrinkles. But at the end of the day, it's the skin turgor test. Just picking up the back of the dorsum of the hand of your skin and letting that go. This should remain relatively elastic into old age. So it's pan syndrome. There's a lot of different symptoms and systems that are affected. And I think this, the big differentiator here, to summarize it in terms of how we sort of liken it maybe or compare it to menopause in women, is that it's so gradual. So unlike women who experience a sudden drop in hormone levels, men typically experience this very gradual, slow, steady decline in testosterone. And what we want to analyze is this naturally otherwise occurring slow, steady decline happening faster and more than it should, typically starting in 30s and continuing of at about a rate of 1% or more per year. It'd be nice to have less than that 1%, and that's the objective.
So when should people, so you're saying it could start in 30s. Is there testing that people should be doing? Is there something they should be looking for so that you catch it before you're really symptomatic?
For sure. So know your numbers, right? Test, don't guess. These are some sort of general, things that we like to, guide an individual or practice by, these slogans. But it always, for me, starts with DNA, genetics, because that never changes. And how we are predisposed to metabolizing hormones. And again, let's just remember, this is not just about hormones. It seems like it would be. And testosterone's a feature factor in this big scenario. But understanding DNA, understanding our hormone pathway. So, by the way, a lot of folks, listeners wouldn't necessarily know this, but whether you're male or female, and genetically, without getting into the weeds about how we may be starting to look at gender differences these days.
You don't have to do that on this podcast, and no one here is. Everyone here is. Yeah, that's okay.
Gotcha. So XY versus XX. Y defining the fact that you are born biologically male. That is a gender difference or a virtue of being male or female, but we all process hormones down the same biochemical pathways. So to be overly simplified about it, we take, whether we're male or female, cholesterol. Most people don't necessarily know that or appreciate that. We can get into this a little bit later on, but for one example of just speaking to cholesterol is that if you're on a statin medication as a male, you're ultimately having more significant challenges to keep testosterone at optimal levels because it will reduce it. And I'm making that point because all hormones start at cholesterol. So cholesterol turns into progesterone, again, male or female. Progesterone turns into testosterone. Testosterone then takes a pathway into dihydrotestosterone, which is like a very virulent, powerful form of testosterone. Then that's ultimately cleared, and testosterone turns into estrogen as well. Again, male or female. So if you're female, what a lot of folks don't realize is that testosterone precursors your estrogen. But the difference, and again, beyond XX or XY, the difference in how an individual processes their hormones is very much genetic. So you can have spectrums in the male physiology. You can have a male who is ultimately, by virtue of the speed at which genetics define how they process these hormones from cholesterol into progesterone, into testosterone, into dihydrotestosterone, et cetera, into estrogen. The speed at which these things are converted define phenotypically whether a male is slightly estrogenized or they're slightly androgenized, or even sometimes beyond. So just to give paint the picture, an individual male, XY, in a gym environment who's just ripped. You picture this individual just like their muscles bursting out of their t-shirt, they work out. You would imagine a lot. Some don't need to because the amount of testosterone and DHT flowing through their system, they produce a lot of DHT, but they're typically bald. Right. And later on in life, they will typically have or experience prostate issues. There's a lot of things that are typical to this male. Then on the other sort of the spectrum, and they, by the way, don't usually have to work out every single day or as often. They just have and retain a lot of muscle mass. Okay. And by the way, there's no good or right genes or bad genes. There's only, what it makes the individual. But I say all this for a point. You have this estrogenized male, and they produce from progesterone and testosterone perhaps a little slower than average. This is the gene called CYP17A1. Cytochrome P450 gene that's responsible for the enzyme that turns progesterone to testosterone. Okay, that might be slow. Then they might be very efficient at turning testosterone through what's called the aromatase gene or the CYP19A1 gene into estrogens. Okay, so park that thought for a minute. That's happening quite quickly. Maybe they also don't produce a lot of DHT, and maybe they clear it very efficiently. So what you're going to have is a lot slimmer male, less, sort of prone to developing muscle mass easily, a full head of hair into their 80s and probably much fewer prostate problems. This individual, and this is really why it's important to your question, full circle, what kind of testing should we do? We have to know as men through DNA, through genes, how we enter this picture to begin with. Are we heading into later life, 50s, 60s, etc., as more estrogenized or more androgenized? It starts there. It has to start there, because from there you can derive ultimately what are more normals on biometric endpoints, such as testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, sex hormone binding globulin. We can talk about a list of things folks can actually go to their family doctor and get tested for. But really, it starts with DNA and how the individual, the speed at which the individual through their DNA are programmed to metabolize these all these hormones. And again, just to recap, male or female, same pathway. Females can also be androgenized. And in those cases, their menopause will be a lot less symptomatic. If they go into menopause very estrogenized, and this is a lot more, sort of complicated in the female body, but if they go in estrogenized or what we call hyperestrogenized, they will have a lot more symptoms, because guess what? That cliff is a lot deeper and more narrow, so boom, they hit this loss of sort of estrogen when their ovaries say, and the brain is saying, not going to evolve any more eggs anymore, and there's the biological clock that kicks off. They are entering this very hard and fast. As guys, again, to recapitulate, we go through this as gradual onset. And by the way, not all men experience this. While the symptoms, that is, and as we talked at the top, many men experience this decline in testosterone as they age, but not all will experience the symptoms of andropause.
Well, it's all very interesting. So would it be okay? Let's just say you are that genetic male who's big and strong and balding. Then doesn't that kind of tell you about your pathway without, does that make, I learned a lot from my DNA
Phenotypes
testing.
tell a lot.
Right. Well, that's just to say I learned a lot. I was, a lot of things from my DNA testing. And one was that I have that mixed profile of androgen and estrogen. I'm kind of mixed and not dominant of either. And I was like, oh, I got the worst of each one though. But you're supposed to have better certain things and better certain things. And I was like, no, I got the worst of this and the worst of this, but whatever. Okay. So I found it very interesting, but I just kind of feel like with that, you kind of know by the time you're 60, if you're strong and muscular, or if you're, thin and maybe getting the man boobs and that other thing, I kind of think. But I do think that what people don't know is exactly what you're talking about. What does that actually mean? Right. So for people to understand what that actually means.
DNA, we can, we can unpack DNA a little further and make this point even better. And as you're sharing this sort of your personal predisposition to codominance, there's tremendous amounts of virtues for that, specifically actually after menopause. But that's a whole other podcast, to be honest. At the end of the day, genes also represent, how other body systems and, biochemical pathways will function for the individual. So let me make this clear. When we're talking about how an individual moves through menopause or andropause as a male, XY male, there's brain involvement. Okay. So the brain, specifically the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, how this plays a role in andropause and signaling the testes to produce testosterone varies individually, given genetics and their activity. This changes with age. This is linked to chronic illnesses, like conditions like obesity, type 2 diabetes, blood pressure. All of this can accelerate the onset of testosterone decline, obviously, right? So the mental health impact. One of the symptoms that we look for clinically before testing anything, genes or blood or urine, is, does this individual experience mood swings more than usual, depression, irritability, loss of libido? Do they wake up with an erection? Do they wake up with anxiety? Mental health impact is huge. So mirroring, in fact, symptoms that some women experience during menopause. It's not so dissimilar. And then there's the bone health stuff I talked about, sleep disruptions. Andropause can lead to insomnia and increased, sleeping during the day. So, but all of those, and this is my point, have genetic affiliations or genetic, backbones to them. So cognitive, issues and executive function are very genetically controlled. the bone health factor, whether or not you absorb and transport vitamin D, your neurohormones and neurotransmitters, all these are interrelated. So and that's what I actually meant. So we're kind of answering the question, what else besides testosterone are we talking about? So let's just paint this picture real simple. If you have certain genes that predispose you to poor management of sugar, and or genes that cause one to gain weight a little easier from certain components within their diet. Well, guess what? There is this, I guess, vicious circle that I like to define that occurs, this vicious cycle. Excess fat and worse metabolic health equals lower testosterone. But lower testosterone, converts into less energy and less exercise, and you feel crappy, which leads to stress eating, which is very executive function and genetically controlled. And then less exercise and worse eating equals lower testosterone, and so on and so forth. This is very much a vicious cycle, but it's all interrelated and controlled by DNA. So that's why this is not just about testosterone. If you are back to your point, if you're very phenotypically an androgenized male, you probably will experience, to your point, like less of a steady decline. But there's other things, that can happen, as it pertains to just beyond the prostate. There's other things that we want to be cognizant of. But yes, if you're an estrogenized male, you will have even more of a challenge through andropause. This is the point. You want to start with your DNA.
And I think everything you're saying is important, because I feel like often what people do is you go to the regular Western doctor, and if their testosterone is low, they just give them testosterone. But that's not really solving the problem. Absolutely. Is that correct? Or maybe it will solve it temporarily.
No.
Right?
No, absolutely. No, there was numerous studies started percolating out of the woodwork in in the mid 2007, 2008 time, big one in the Journal of Endocrinological Metabolism, and it showed evidence that population level declines in testosterone levels in American men was occurring. And by 10 years later, and even more recently, TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, in the market was estimated somewhere upwards of $5 billion US. But we're kind of starting to get a little more conservative about this now, because we're realizing in replacement therapy, it became very popularized, right? And people were setting up clinics focused on this anti-aging and testosterone and slowing the decline of testosterone. And we're realizing this actually may contribute to cancer, right? This was the whole, debate around hormone replacement therapy in women, and actually they're revisiting that and actually probably seeing, less of a cancer inference than they once thought. But it seems to be the opposite for men. This needs to be better studied. But I'm going to come back to this whole notion of, if you think it's testosterone, even if you test maybe appropriately with blood markers and you have that androgenized male and you give them extra testosterone, you can cause problems. Not to mention, what did I tell you in the beginning? And everyone heard me say, testosterone turns into estrogen. So for an estrogenized male, depending on how their patterns are flowing, sometimes you can give an individual testosterone, and you're actually just growing their man boobs. They're hyperestrogenizing. So it's a very intimate and detailed picture, and it needs to be evaluated typically by somebody who both infers the genetic side as well as the and by the way, on that note, and we can talk more about testing if you want. Really understanding how to appropriately test matters as well. Serological testing, or just what's floating around in your bloodstream, is not the same as how your body has used those hormones and ultimately peed them out. I think one of the best ways to determine how your hormones are working at any given time, as well as to how the intervention, such as TRT or hormone replacement therapy, might be, is using N-metabolic or N-metabolites for urine, called a Dutch test, dried urine comprehensive testing.
Mm-hmm. And just so people know, there are people in Israel who are doing Dutch testing and sending it off to somewhere, I think in the US. I don't think it's actually done in Israel, but I do know functional medicine doctors here who are using it. by sending it away. I think it takes a while. I think it's very expensive,
Right.
but I think that starting testing, especially when people are not feeling good, are worth doing. Yeah. So you're saying, as you would want to maybe start doing some of this testing before you actually feel any symptoms. So is it something you would recommend that every male in their late 30s do some type of testing before they start to feel anything, or based on the way they look, or only once you have symptoms, or?
So this affects andropause, that is at large, for all these different reasons we're talking about, genetic that influence, some things that are beyond just the hormonal, metabolic, DNA controlled hormonal cascade. It affects, half of men over the age of 50. Statistically, almost 40% of men in their 40s have low testosterone. Um, you know, uh, by 18 years old, testosterone peaks. That's the story, 18 to 20, depending on the individual. And then it starts to go down by about 1 to 2% per year on average. And as I mentioned, andropause affects, this 30 to 40% of aging men, and they do show symptoms when they are in, significant decline. Low testosterone, never go the clinician has to know, but low testosterone never goes without any ramifications. So I would say, because of this, in your 30s you'd want to start to be cognizant about it, waiting until you're in your 50s, but having appropriate baseline, because through hormonal replacement therapy, we never want to give guys in their 50s and 60s the percentage of hormones that were present in their body in their 20s. That makes no sense. This is age matched, right, over time. And by the way, one of the precursors that we didn't talk about when it comes to hormones produced in the body non-specifically or non-genetically related is the adrenal glands. There's so many reasons why men, through this pathway, end up with low amounts of testosterone. And DHEA is a master hormone that also converts into other androgens. So if individuals experienced environmentally a higher amount of stress in their life than usual, the adrenals are like battery backups. And in the same way, the female body, if they're blasted by the time they're into menopause and andropause, it can significantly affect DHEA. The amount of DHEA can significantly affect the amount of free flowing testosterone. So a few other things to keep in mind when you're thinking about when to sort of initiate this testing is, can you no longer put on the muscle mass you used to? Are you more tired or trending towards depression? Go back to those symptoms in the beginning. So yeah, get this baseline like you would for cholesterol with your family doctor. Ask them for not just testosterone. And again, this comes back to appropriate testing. You want to ask them for testosterone, free testosterone, the full bioavailable testosterone, as well as sex hormone binding globulin. All these things should be sort of matched to a baseline. And then over the years, especially when you're symptomatic, start to, consider supplementation. It doesn't always have to be hormones themselves. Sometimes this can be herbs that can keep baselines up. But even more than herbs, it's lifestyle, it's diet. One of the best ways to get growth hormone up, which ultimately translates into testosterone for guys, is really good, we call this clean eating, but really good high protein diets. This whole notion of, too much protein is hard on the kidneys, I think, is being debunked. And I think we have to get back to the 1 to 2 grams per pound of body weight on average. This translates to all sexes in general, but having enough protein in the diet, clean protein, a lot of evidence coming out around intermittent fasting. But having that amount of protein, which is not so easy to get, in that, if you're doing a 16-8 intermittent fasting, in the 8 hours that you're eating, if a male weighs 180 pounds, to get 180 grams of protein in that time, you have to kind of calculate and be cognizant of that, right? So that starts with good diet. And we're meant to push, pull, jump, squat, lift, you against minimum gravity, but ideally you should be able to pull up your body weight, press your own body weight, squat 1 or 2 times your own body weight, all these things at minimum. And that's going to translate into muscle mass and help prevent the decline of muscle. So muscle mass and leanness of muscle mass, the fat tissue percentage in your body, all this relates to testosterone and DHT. Like there's linear correlation here, right? So very, very very important. And then last but not least, within the trifecta here is optimal sleep, appreciating sleep hygiene. We got to get back to that. If you look, there's a direct loss or decline, about 20-30% decline in testosterone after a single poor night's sleep, and so we got to get optimal sleep hygiene, to remind your listeners, is really good. Dark environment, circadian rhythm matters here. Melatonin production and daytime serotonin production all play in this cascade. Comfortable, you got to be, the less you're waking up and having broken sleep, and some background noise, white noise if you're getting woken up. But here's the most important thing. And the last book I wrote was all about brain health, called Brain Spanning. So this also translates, by the way, andropause and cognitive decline very directly. But the one most important thing we can do at night that also translates into optimal growth hormone and testosterone and prevents, decline and so forth, is sleeping in a cool environment. We need 68 or so degrees in our environment, with our sheet or blanket not above our neck. Of course, our head has to be cool in order for these hormones to work efficiently, and also to do what's called lymphatic detoxification. So our brains don't have lymph, they have glymph or glial cells, non-thinking cells that help to drain the brain or detoxify the brain. And that only happens between about 65 and 68 degrees at night. So if your room's too hot, not to mention how that presents a problem for a lot of people that are hormonally dysregulated. But if it's not cool in your room, you're not doing that. So that's sleep hygiene, the right amount of protein, and ultimately the exercise that we got to get in order to maintain, optimal levels.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. First of all, that's fascinating. And I know, I love sleeping in a cool room. Like, I love sleeping in a cold room, warm blanket. I can't get it. I can't hate the heat. When people want to put on the heat in the winter, I can't stand it. But anyways, so I like hearing that. And I plan at some point definitely to have someone on to do a whole podcast about sleep, because I do think sleep is so undervalued. And I think that lack of sleep with a couple of people I know with autoimmune diseases had a huge impact on their development of those autoimmune conditions. What about the thyroid? Does that play a role at all in regulating?
Yeah. So there's an indirect, I like to say nothing in the body is superfluous and nothing in the body is not connected. I mean, that's it at the end of the day. So the way the anterior pituitary gland, the hypothalamus all kind of starts there, as I mentioned earlier, in the brain. And so cognitive decline and how one is predisposed to cognitive decline genetically might be a big underlying cause as to how hormones get amok later on in life. So this is not just the hormone pathway, genetically or otherwise. So, and I say that because the feedback loop for the thyroid, it also starts there, in the midbrain. It's like a thermostat. When you turn on your heat in the winter, you hear that little click on the thermostat. That would be akin to your hypothalamus telling your pituitary, or your pituitary gland telling your hypothalamus to make thyroid releasing hormone, right? Once thyroid releasing hormones emitted, then your thyroid knows to produce, thyroid stimulating hormones then released. Your thyroid knows to produce T3 or T4. When that's produced in the periphery, there's a feedback loop, reverse T3. And then that we've now hit the temperature we want, and that, shuts it off momentarily. And that's called a negative feedback loop. So that can get interrupted via indirectly the sex steroidal pathway. But it plays obviously a huge, and men are less susceptible to this epidemiologically for a number of reasons, we could get into if you want. But at the end of the day, the thyroid, it plays this sort of master role of metabolism. And so how this would relate, and some males are slightly hypothyroid. We like to see ranges between 1 and 2.5 if we're talking optimal TSH. thyroid stimulating hormone. And when it's not, then you tend to metabolically, you tend to slow down a little bit outside of just testosterone. That's why all of this plays a role, right? And when you gain fat tissue in a male, particularly abdominal, visceral fat, that is estrogenizing fat. It will cause testosterone to decrease. So, straight out answer to your question, yeah, thyroid is absolutely involved. And sometimes by taking testosterone, you'll see indirect, improvements in metabolism. So yeah, they're all related. I think something that is underappreciated when it comes to what else impacts us through andropause is our environment. We talked about sleep hygiene. That's something we can control, but other things we might want to pay attention to comes through our waterways, comes through our cosmetics. And I know guys don't necessarily put a lot of, makeup on their face, but they're exposed to these things and they should work to limit some of them. So this is easily accessible. The Environmental Working Group in North America, subsidiary of the Environmental Protection Agency, has come up with this cosmetic database. Anyone can go to this and put in whatever shampoo they might use or whatever, cosmetic, hygiene product they might use. Shaving cream's a huge problem.
Oh, wow.
Cologne is a big problem. So, BPA, we've heard a lot of that, right? Bisphenol A, this is way back in the 60s, considered this ideal, light, resilient, less likely than other plastics who absorb odors and so forth. But this is shown to interact with estrogen receptors, male and female. Phthalates, like this is the PHTH phthalates. It's a classic chemical that is added to plastics, also implicated in testosterone production interference. So that's a big one. That's in fragrance, and shaving creams, and then there's parabens. These are the preservative aspect of what's in our products, moisturizing, shaving creams and gels, etc. So what these do is simply mimic estrogens and or block androgen receptors. So you want to go to this database, put in your products, and if they have a high, because they're looking at immunological toxicity as well as carcinogenicity factors. But if this is an endocrinological disruptor, you don't want to use this stuff. It is very powerful. It's potent. What we put on our skin absorbs into our system. And I mentioned water. I mean, there's all kinds of pharmacological, imagine the amount of birth control pill that we're peeing out into our waterways. It's obscene. And this doesn't degrade. It comes back to us, and our treatment plans that are citywide, local, government controlled, they're typically, like, we like to call this quote unquote safe water. And, usually it is, but it's not pure. It's not filtered for these things. These things impact us. Okay. They will get into our body and they will disrupt specifically, these estrogen receptor sites. So if you don't want to be the filter, then you have to have a filter. And typically RO, in my opinion, some of the best filtration technology to get rid of all this garbage. But that's tip of the iceberg. There's other things too, like besides environment. I think what we need to talk about is, a lot of medications out there, not to necessarily always talk to your doctor or pharmacist before changing anything that you might do. But I mentioned this right at the top, statins, because they lower cholesterol, are going to have a downstream effect. They will also lower testosterone levels almost irrefutably. You have to be on CoQ10 if you're on a statin, by the way, to offset a lot of the side effects, regardless as to whether you have symptoms. But beta blockers, hypertension medications,
this is all
chronic
important.
use of other over-the-counter things, like, yeah.
Because we're talking about, andropause, we're talking about male menopause. And as people age, how many people, like, I don't know what the number is. I feel like it's more than 1 out of 2 are on statins and blood pressure medication. And, that's what people are taking. And then they're reaching this age, they're already on this medication. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just feel like it's so important to make sure that people are hearing this, because it is something that most people are taking. Most people end up on these things as they age, as their hormone levels are decreasing anyways. And then they're being put on these things that,
Yeah.
So I apologize for interrupting you.
No. Listen, I can be loquacious. I can go on and on and on. That's, both an Achilles heel, perhaps, as well as maybe sometimes a virtue. No, but please interrupt anytime you want. I just have a lot to share. And at the end of the day, I feel like coming back to understanding your DNA, if we were to do sort of a midway recap here, is really important, and test and address. So once you know your DNA, that never changes, but to have your finger on the pulse, there's a lot of ways in which you can appropriately and properly test yourself, including looking at the right type of end markers or endpoints. This is the tightly bound testosterone, right? So 2/3 of testosterone in your blood is bound to this sex hormone binding globulin I keep talking about, not readily available to your body. So that's important to note. And then there's the loosely bound testosterone, which is approximately 1/3. And that's the weakly bound to the protein albumin in your blood. Once that's broken, by the way, the testosterone circulates freely, and then there's the free testosterone, and this is very genetic. Your body can readily use this stuff, but depending on your genetic aptitude or this enzyme 5-alpha reductase, which converts it into dihydrotestosterone, the very potent androgen, it will vary person to person. So knowing these levels and your bioavailable testosterone, so the loosely bound and free testosterone that compose your bioavailable testosterone, has the most impact on your overall health. And this range should basically be about 10, Canadian here, but 10 nanomoles per liter, or about 300 or so nanograms per deciliter. So upper range of 35. Don't want to go beyond that if you're actually using it. And I just want to underscore again, exercise, stress, sleep, diet. I mean, these are so important. Protein levels, getting that body, stressed against weights, right? So 15 to 30 minutes every single day. Even cold exposure, by the way, this might be interesting for your listeners. I'm sure you've covered this topic, but especially the back, whether it's a very cold shower, that everyone's into these cold immersions or polar plunges these days, this can help to grow brown fat, especially in those that are more predisposed to estrogen dominance in males. Brown fat's this metabolic fat that's got mitochondria in it. It can actually improve your metabolism. And stress, cortisol. I mean, it's going to be a huge. If people don't know how to manage their stress, they've got to kind of start there. And exercise is a great way to do that. And then sleep. We talked about this, but again, this is literally 10 to 20% reduction in testosterone in one night from broken or poor sleep, typically sleep hygiene that does that.
Yeah. And I just want to add in, which I'm sure you know as well, that a great way to learn to reduce stress is by learning how to actually breathe, since no one knows how to breathe the right way pretty much. And it's the first thing I teach every single one of my patients pretty much. So yeah, great for stress reduction.
I couldn't agree with you more. And also just learning maybe a simple free, online apps on your phone, learning how to optimize heart rate variability. This is something everyone can do. Whether it's box breath or the 5-7-8 technique, or it's improving resilience through, the cold plunges we talk about, or the, even heat sauna, all these things to improve resilience will ultimately diminish the overall impact of stress. And as we age, this becomes even more important.
Yeah, so we've actually covered sauna, and that was great. We had Brian Richards from Sauna Space on. I haven't yet found the person to come on yet that I wanted to talk about cold exposure, but I do intend to do that. And I personally detest cold exposure, hate it, love sauna, hate cold exposure, but also hate winter and love the long hot summers we have here. So I'm sure that has something to do with my love of one and detest of the other. But I do know that it's incredible. And I do know, and I don't know, this is a little bit off topic, but talking about cold exposure, it's interesting because I have a friend who is also in the health, allied health field. And she loves cold exposure. She loves it. But she's someone who suffers from anxiety. I detest it. And I'm not someone who suffers from anxiety. So I don't know if there's a correlation between, like, you might love it and need it more if you are someone who has more of that tendency, which I already knew. but I was happy to have confirmed. And I told Kashif that I hadn't, even when my DNA test said that I'm not likely to be kept up at night, like dwelling on things, and, I don't have a lot of anxiety. I was like, I'm only getting anxious reading some of the things that I am finding out new on this DNA test, but in general, I don't have anxiety. So I don't know if that might be why, someone might have one versus having the other. I don't, that's a little off of menopause
No, it for
topic, but I just
sure,
found that
it for sure
interesting.
translates.
Yeah, I found that
Yep.
interesting.
No, executive function and your predisposition, particularly to catecholamine degradation. So COMT, the catecholamine methyltransferase gene, and the DRD2, the dopamine receptor D2 gene, and even ADRA2B, all of these things can, and BDNF, all these things can predict whether or not somebody is more likely to continue compliance through cold plunging, because not that it's fun or particularly comfortable for anybody, no matter what your genetic predispositions to executive function are, but because of the positive repercussions afterwards, it will definitely cause a significant surge of catecholamine saturation, dopamine, adrenaline, and that lasts a lot longer for these individuals that otherwise don't have this hamster wheel, so yeah, it's very genetic. So yes, you can kind of get addicted to it, if you will, some people more than others. But I just think, it comes back to resilience at the end of the day. What are we trying to do? We're trying to improve the hormesis curve, right? So if hormesis is the idea of a small exposure to a stressor, not all stress is bad, even including the adrenal stressors and cortisol, there's optimal levels. Goldilocks formula, right? Too little, not going to happen, nothing. Too much could kill you. But if you constantly, exposed to hormetic doses of stressors, then the body's elasticity, the ability for the body's sympathetic system to bounce back from a sympathetic state to a parasympathetic state, itself is like a muscle or an elastic band. And by doing these exposures, really hot, really cold, really intense, or even environmental exposures to fears, these kinds of things will ultimately improve that elasticity over time. So indirect relationship to what we're talking about, andropause and so forth. But one thing you will know for sure, this is a symptom, subclinical set, but when you feel like you are less resilient to life, or you're not as strong or energy deprived, these are all symptoms that some of the endocrine system might be out of whack. That's for sure. So if you don't have the desire, zest, or zeal, not just for sex or libido is a little low, but for life, I think that's a good point for a guy to start getting tested for all of these different endpoints.
Okay, so can I ask you, you probably don't even remember what my final question will be. And I just want to apologize if you're hearing yipping. There are 4 puppies in the corner of my room. My dog had puppies 7.5 weeks ago, and my kids woke them up. So now they're yipping a little bit. But before I do ask you that final question, could we just sum up what are the things that you feel like we talked about all of it, but just to kind of give people a summation of like what you should start testing for when. And like you're talking about, you've spoken about all along the things that you would suggest people do to be more resilient, just so people have like a handy little list if they want to take out a pen and paper and kind of write down things to be thinking about.
Sure. So as a guy, it starts in your 30s, and not everyone has symptoms, but the testosterone will start to decline. This is really driven largely by our DNA. So start there, understand what your DNA is, and have this blueprint, this manual, if you will, as your guide into anything else that you might judge against or test. Then into your 40s and 50s, you want to test the right way. And by the way, it can happen earlier than this, but this is typically when we might start to feel mood is a little bit lower, libido is a little bit, sort of on the decline. One big signal we haven't spoken about, by the way, is first morning erection. This should happen just physiologically without any sexual thoughts. You should wake up with an erection. That's healthy for a guy. If that stops happening, and or you have anxiety, depression, broken sleep, loss of zest or zeal in life, these are times to start to talk to your doctor about it and question them whether this is testosterone, not getting a prescription for an antidepressant. Okay. These go hand in hand, low testosterone and mood disorders, anxiety. So these are ways to now testing appropriately really should be looking at the big picture. Once you already know your DNA, you should be starting to evaluate through your family doctor. It's fine to get some baseline serologically, but this is just what's floating around your blood, not necessarily a true picture of what is moving through cells and working the way it should be. So for that, I recommend the Dutch or dried urine. But with your family doctor, so long as you do it right, it's a great window in, first sort of line approach. And that would be looking at testosterone, dihydrotestosterone or DHT, bioavailable testosterone, and sex hormone binding globulin. And if we're thinking about, other things, there's a presentation of gynecomastia or man boobs, significant testicular atrophy, for example, hypogonadism, then you want to be looking at others like estrogen and progesterone, et cetera. Anyways, those are the baselines. I think that there's also, we haven't talked about this, but supplemental intervention, like nutraceutical intervention. Everyone's a little different. Yes. A lot of these are also informed by DNA. But before I get to those, to summarize to your sort of question or desire to summarize, the resiliency is going to be improved by that trifecta of exercising. And this is not just sort of getting your steps in. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about push, pull, jump, squat, lift. We all need to be able to move our own body weight. If you can't as a male, females are a little different. They're just geared differently. But as a male, if you can't do pull-ups, at least, 10, work your way up, and you can't do push-ups and you can't do squats at the minimum with your own body weight, but ideally with weights involved, there's already going to be sarcopenia more than there should be, loss of muscle mass, which will directly translate into the amount of testosterone that you'll be able to reserve into older age. So, this has got to be in place. Sleep, deep sleep, restful sleep, which should only happen when sleep hygiene, all the boxes are checked there. And then diet, 1 to 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight, and ideally mixing that with intermittent fasting, because this whole glycemic, insulin insensitivity, glycemic levels, weight, and testosterone, discrepancies are directly related. Supplementally, I think, and there's genes for this, zinc, men who in studies received about 30 milligrams or so zinc per day showed increased levels of free testosterone. So it can be very powerful depending on zinc genes. There are genes related to that, or your exposure to the zinc copper ratio. Vitamin D, we've heard about, there's umpteen studies on this. Deficiency directly causes low testosterone. I think magnesium is under touted. This helps, indirectly. There's things that are direct and more indirect, but this is where insulin sensitivity plays a role, which therefore directly influences testosterone. We talk about bones, or typically we forget about boron and manganese and strontium, but boron, besides its anti-inflammatory effects and bone mineralization effects, can also help with hormone balance and testosterone. Particularly, we talked a little bit about DHEA as it pertains to the adrenal emission of DHEA, but especially when tested low, this converts into testosterone. When tested low, this could be the underlying cause. Hypoadrenal function in somebody who's led a life full of mental, emotional stress could be an underlying reason for low testosterone. And then I like others, like there's some good, decent, I'm going to call it decent, not great, decent evidence around things like Tongat Ali, which is basically anti-estrogenic, not so much, testosterone inducing, and fenugreek, which is kind of like an anti-diabetic and libido booster. We hear about adrenal resetters or adrenal support. I like Panax, ginseng, which may also slightly increase testosterone. I love horny goatweed, which some studies show boosts testosterone. So this is the thorns on this. it's a name is funny, but yeah, it's the one that most will remember. And then this one is really important to note. This doesn't boost testosterone, but again, this correlation to sarcopenia and loss of muscle mass is beta hydroxy beta methylbutyrate, or HMB for short. And this is a downstream metabolite of leucine, the branched chain amino acid, essential amino acid. You can never get enough of this out of your diet. It's impossible to get enough of this, but this will pretty much put a stop on sarcopenia. And you can supplement with this as a powder. People can learn more about this. MyHMB is a good place to go, myhmb.com. But this maintains muscle mass as a metabolite of leucine, and it may also, by virtue of that pathway, boost testosterone. And then, maybe last but not least, because I'm rambling on with a long list here, but I like berberine. I think there's way, too much attention to this as like some kind of a, Ozempic, switch out. It's not. But in the short to medium term use of this in somebody who's especially got genetics that are showing insulin insensitivity and predisposition to diabetes, I think this is a really cool nutraceutical ingredient that people can look to help balance blood sugar as well, or maybe even better than metformin, some of the studies show. And some folks, and again, this is individualizing people, but some folks have a problem more on that side of things with metabolism of blood sugar, which translate back to fat tissue accumulation, which translates into estrogenization. So that's my laundry list.
Well, I do think that, like you said, you gave us a long list of supplements, and obviously not everything's right for everyone. So anybody who is starting to think about this should be in contact with someone, either with you or with someone like you. You probably do Zoom consults today, I assume, and I'm guessing. Do you do Zoom today?
I do. I usually restrict them. I still really appreciate seeing people in person, but
I know.
I usually reserve them for results, like a laboratory result day.
Okay.
But yeah, I know I still do take virtual consults for people that are restricted in travel from being,
right,
kind of around North America is really my clientele.
Oh, okay. Well, I do know that also anybody who's done DNA testing, you can meet with different functional medicine practitioners through the DNA company as well, and they really know how to use your results. So, because like you said, you gave a long list, and I think that they all sound great, but I think that people do need to work with an expert in order to know which things and what are the amounts and are going to be right for them and all of that. So, I mean, I could talk to you all day. This is a fascinating conversation. But let me ask you, the question I always ask everyone, and you might not remember this, is my final question is always, what does spirituality mean to you?
Listen, I would not classify myself as either atheist or agnostic. I would classify myself as spiritually undecided. But one thing I think about when I think about the term spirituality is I think anthropomorphism, or how human contrived notion is a very interesting thing. I think that we take certain terms and mix them up with what their true meaning is. So if I get beyond that, and the likelihood of most human contrived notion, whether it's within politics or religion, as misconstrued, I would end up saying this is kind of a third or maybe even a fourth prong on the stool that's necessary to maintain balance in life. So for me, it's being in harmony with oneself mentally and emotionally, and the people around you being good. A lot of the teachings that come from religion, but at the same time not necessarily having to buy into a singular higher power, but to maybe invest a little more into a centric energy that we all have within us. There's a slogan. This might sound kind of cheeseball compared to what we're really talking about here, but your health is an investment, never an expense. And by expense, I mean, time, your time investment, your monetary investment, your energy investment. So you got to do all those things to see that return. And I guess what we're trying to do at the end of the day, we call this health span or whatever we call this, is if you miss that element of spirituality, whatever you want to call it, central energy, if you don't really consider that as one of the things you're trying to grow, then I feel maybe a lot of this is a lost cause. Like it's more likely somebody's going to think, what the hell is the point of all this? So I'm trying to come in somewhere in the middle where you don't necessarily have to consider spirituality as, any derivative of religion, and it might be too often misconstrued that way, but investment in one's central energy and vitality, their zeal and zest for life. That's what it does. That's what that word means for me.
Listen, I think that's great. And you don't know me, you don't really know me personally, but this actually comes from my belief. While I am a religious person, I believe very, very strongly that religion and spirituality are two different things, because I know many people who are religious who are not at all spiritual. And I know many people who are spiritual who are not at all religious. And everybody sort of has a different take on what spirituality means to them. And everybody has a spiritual spark within them when they stop to think about it. And it doesn't have to be the same, and it's so personal. And that's why I like to hear from different people. And I no way think that someone has to be religious to be spiritual. Sometimes they can go hand in hand, but not always. So I think that that's great. Thank you so much. And where can people find you if they want to hear more from you?
Thanks,
You're amazing. You've written so many books and been on TV and so many podcasts.
So look, the DNAcompany.com is a great place to send folks to learn more about that particular test model. As a co-founder of the company, very proud of that, and what my founding partners, Kashif Khan and Dr. Mansour Mohammed and Haris Khan, have all been able to do over the years to, just accelerate learning and teaching through this. So this is a testing portal, but also where you can go and have some clinical support by our team of amazing doctors and clinicians. So the DNAcompany.com. And then my own website portal is Wylde on Health, my last name, WYLDE on health.com. And just sort of, trip around that site. There's some little really cool links where you can put in, there's over 250,000 pages of recipes, and there's this whole interactions checker. So if you're taking a drug, what you might want to avoid mixing in with that particular drug, prescription. And also, by the way, side benefits you might get from taking certain things. By example, I mentioned earlier, if you're taking a statin drug and how this interrelates to testosterone, you want to be taking coenzyme Q10. So you can stick this in. And so listen, 500,000 plus pages of free information at that website. And thanks very much for having me, Torah. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. And I'll link his Instagram. I know he's on Instagram and anything else, social media otherwise I find. But thank you so much. This was really informative. It was interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey guys, this week's Torah Extra is going to be short and sweet because it is brought to you by none other than me, but not really me. It's brought to you by me with a little help from Chat GPT. Some would be embarrassed to admit that. I am not, because as I've often said, I'm more the facilitator of these episodes, and I like to bring on real Torah experts. But this week, my Torah expert was not feeling well, and I really wanted to put out an episode. And I decided that to put the Manopause episode or the andropause episode back out was a really great follow-up to last week's episode on female menopause. And we know that the Torah doesn't specifically talk about menopause. It does not specifically talk about andropause. But what it does give us is a little bit of information. It gives us little hints towards the way our ancestors may have aged and things that might indicate some of these changes that come about as people age. So we know that as David HaMelech was getting older, he was described as being cold. I believe this was in Malachim, in the book of Kings. He was described as feeling cold, needing extra warmth. And all this sort of suggests maybe metabolic changes and hormonal changes that could be indicating some of these changes that go on as people get older and age. Although Moshe, on the other hand, was actually described as having full strength, even at 120 years old. But that's really the exception rather than the rule. And we all know people who just do not seem to be their age. But most of them are the exception. They're not necessarily the rule. But I do believe that as society does age, we will find more and more people being that exception due to some of these things that we can do to offset some of these changes. And, there is a shift that goes from strength to wisdom. Like the Torah kind of shows us this shift that as people get older and their maybe physical abilities decline, there's more of a shift towards appreciating them for their wisdom as well. So in Leviticus, which I believe is Vayikra, I'm not so up and I'm not so great on the English translation of the Hebrew books of the Torah. We are commanded, you shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. So this kind of reflects the shift in societal value from strength to knowledge as well. And there's also kind of more of an emotional and a spiritual adaptation that goes on as people were aging. And in Ecclesiastes, which again I believe is Kohelet, the entire book sort of poetically describes these challenges of aging, including people having weaker physical abilities, but continued spiritual relevance as well. And in Psalms, it says they will still bear fruit in old age. They will stay fresh and green, which reinforces the idea that aging doesn't mean losing your purpose. There may be changes, but it doesn't mean that you've lost your purpose. And we also know that studying Torah and all sorts of, engaging the mind are really, really important for our well-being. I don't think this is really just with aging. I believe this is really throughout our lives, but this may offset some of the psychological effects of andropause as well. And we know that the Avot are seen as models of aging, of the way they age, right? Both Abraham and Sarah, they were at an advanced age, first of all, when Yitzchak was born, but we're going to talk about the male side of this today. They were still very active in what they were doing, and Abraham even remarried after Sarah passed away. So though Yitzchak was blind in his later years, which kind of shows us some of the physical declines that could come along with aging as well. I think that macular degeneration, which people are at risk of as they get older, can be a cause of blindness if it's not treated well, and we try to treat that, right? We don't let every physical decline get in the way. But he still remained a key spiritual figure even throughout. And Yaakov, as he aged, he gathered his children around him to bless them, which kind of emphasized his legacy and wisdom over physical strength. And unlike the modern world where we only focus on fighting aging, the Torah will often see aging as a natural and honorable transition. Now, I know that goes a little bit against what we're talking about in this episode, because I do believe that in order to continue to be spiritual and continue to really be entrenched in what's going on in the world, you have to feel really good. And the world is so much more toxic today than it was in the generation of our ancestors, that just living, just the air we breathe and all of the products we have around us. So I believe it's not the same thing, that we really do have to try to fight some of these things, because if you don't feel good, it is very hard to engage in doing mitzvot as well. So even though the Torah may not directly engage in talking about andropause, we see that all of the Avot, everybody, and all of our elders remain a very, very vital and important part of our societies, even as they aged. So that's just a little small takeaway. Thank you, Chat GPT. I'm sure I probably could have guided it to give me things that were deeper, but I wanted to give you guys just a little bit of a taste. And I hope that you guys will enjoy this episode and share it with all the men in your life, unless you're a man listening to this, and then just share it with the women in your life and more men. Thanks a lot, guys. Purim Sameach. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Please seek guidance from a trusted healthcare professional. By listening to this podcast, you release Holy Health and all of its guests from all liability. I'd like to thank Yakir Abelo for editing this podcast.